My brother invented seizures to get disability benefits. When he had a real stroke at 34, paramedics delayed treatment, assuming it was another act. The paramedic looked at my brother Caleb convulsing on the kitchen floor and checked his watch. He actually checked his watch while my brother's face was twisted and his left arm was locked at a grotesque angle. The paramedic, whose name tag read J. Williams, glanced at his partner and said something I'll never forget. "How long you want to give him this time before he drops the act?" His partner, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back tight, was already reviewing something on a tablet. She showed Williams the screen, and I saw Caleb's name with a long list of entries beneath it. Williams nodded and crouched down about 3 feet away from where Caleb was sprawled on the linoleum, maintaining distance like you would from a wild animal that might lunge. He pulled out his phone and started timing. I was screaming that this was different, that something was actually wrong, but Williams just held up one finger to silence me and kept his eyes on his phone's stopwatch. 90 seconds passed, then 2 minutes. Caleb's convulsions didn't stop the way they usually did. His face was turning a color I'd never seen before, grayish-purple, and drool was running from the corner of his mouth in a way that looked nothing like his performances. At 3 minutes, Williams finally stood up and said to his partner, "All right, this might actually be real." I'd been living with my brother Caleb's seizure scam for exactly 2 years and 4 months when that morning happened. It started small, the way these things always do, with him mentioning to our mother that he'd felt dizzy at work and blacked out for a few seconds. Mom, who'd worried about both of us excessively since our father died when we were teenagers, immediately wanted him to see a doctor. Caleb brushed it off, saying it was probably just stress from his job at the warehouse. But then a week later, he called me at 11 o'clock at night saying he'd had another episode, this one worse, and he was scared. I drove across town to his apartment and found him sitting on his couch looking perfectly fine, eating chips and watching a basketball game. When I asked what happened, he described symptoms he'd clearly researched online: the aura before the seizure, the loss of consciousness, the confusion afterward. He said he was going to see a neurologist. I told him that was smart and offered to go with him. He said he'd handle it alone. Over the next 3 months, Caleb's seizures became a regular feature of family conversations. He'd call Mom crying about having one at the grocery store. He'd text me photos of bruises he claimed were from falling during episodes. He started carrying a medical alert card in his wallet that he'd show people, explaining he had epilepsy and they should call 911 if they saw him seizing. Mom wanted to help, so she started researching seizure disorders obsessively, printing out articles and calling Caleb with suggestions for treatments and specialists. He'd thank her and say he was working with doctors, but the seizures kept happening. When I asked him which neurologist he was seeing, he gave me a name I couldn't find in any medical directory. When I questioned that, he got defensive and said I was being unsupportive during the hardest time of his life. I backed off because I didn't want to be the asshole brother who doubted someone with a medical condition. The real genius of Caleb's scam was how he escalated it gradually. First, he lost his warehouse job because of the seizures, or so he told our mother. She immediately offered to help him with rent, which he accepted gratefully. Then he started missing family dinners because he was too tired from medications. Then he filed for disability benefits, saying his neurologist recommended he stop working entirely because the seizures were too frequent and unpredictable. I remember sitting at Mom's kitchen table when he showed us the disability application, all official forms with medical codes I didn't understand. Mom cried and hugged him, saying she was so sorry he was going through this but proud of him for taking care of himself. I watched him hug her back and saw something in his eyes that made my stomach turn. He looked triumphant, not relieved or scared or even sad. Triumphant. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed Caleb's seizures always happened when it was convenient for him. He'd have one right before he was supposed to help Mom move furniture. He'd have another when he was supposed to meet me to discuss him paying back money he'd borrowed. He had a particularly severe episode the day before he was supposed to interview for a part-time job Mom had arranged for him through a friend. Each seizure came with detailed descriptions posted on social media, generating floods of sympathy and concern from friends and distant relatives. People sent him money. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $50 there, to help with medical expenses. Then someone set up a GoFundMe without him even asking, and donations started pouring in. Within 6 months, Caleb had raised $8,400 from people who believed he was fighting a serious medical condition. I confronted him about it on a Saturday afternoon in March. I drove to his apartment unannounced and found him in his living room playing video games, completely fine, surrounded by energy drink cans and takeout containers. When I asked him point blank if the seizures were real, his whole demeanor changed. The friendly brother act disappeared and something colder took its place. He told me I had no idea what I was talking about. He said his medical records were private and none of my business. When I pushed harder, asking why I could never find the neurologist he claimed to see, he accused me of harassing him and told me to leave. I asked about the GoFundMe money, and he said that was also none of my business, that people donated voluntarily because they cared about him. I left his apartment shaking with anger, knowing he was lying, but having no proof beyond my gut instinct. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Caleb at 3 o'clock in the morning. He was crying, saying he'd had the worst seizure yet and ended up in the emergency room. Could I come get him? I threw on clothes and drove to County General Hospital, my mind racing between concern that maybe I'd been wrong and anger that he was probably still performing. I found him in the ER waiting room, discharge papers in hand, looking exhausted but fine. A nurse walked by, and when I asked her about my brother's condition, she gave me a look I couldn't quite read. She said they'd monitored him for 2 hours, and everything came back normal. She emphasized the word normal in a way that felt significant. Caleb cut in quickly, explaining that seizures often don't show up on tests, that his neurologist had told him that. The nurse walked away without responding. In the car driving him home, I asked which tests they'd run. Caleb listed off medical terms with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed them. When I got home, I looked up everything he'd said. Half of it was contradictory, and the other half didn't apply to seizure diagnosis at all. The disability approval came through in June, almost exactly 1 year after Caleb's first reported episode. He called Mom with the news, and she cried tears of relief, saying at least now he'd have income and insurance while dealing with his condition. The monthly payments were $1,340, which combined with his GoFundMe donations and Mom's occasional help, meant Caleb was living comfortably without working at all. I watched this happen and felt increasingly sick about it, but what could I do? I had no medical expertise. I had no proof. All I had was suspicion, and the evidence of my own eyes showing Caleb living a normal, active life, except when someone was watching and he needed to perform disability. I started documenting things anyway. I took screenshots of his social media posts showing him at concerts and bars during weeks he'd told Mom he was too sick to leave his apartment. I noted the pattern of his seizures always occurring right before obligations he wanted to avoid. I tracked the GoFundMe donations and where the money seemed to be going based on his purchases. Mom got suspicious around month 15. She'd gone to Caleb's apartment to drop off groceries and found him playing basketball in the parking lot with neighbors. When she asked how he could do that with his condition, he said his neurologist had recently changed his medication and he was having a good day. Mom mentioned it to me over dinner, her voice uncertain, saying something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. I wanted to tell her everything I'd noticed, but I also didn't want to be the one to break her heart by suggesting her son was faking a disability. Instead, I suggested she ask to come to one of his neurologist appointments. She brightened at that idea and called Caleb that night. He told her the appointments were too boring and medical, that she didn't need to waste her time. She pushed gently, and he got irritated, saying he was an adult who could handle his own medical care. Mom backed off, but I could see doubt creeping into her expression when she talked about him after that. The real turning point came when Caleb called 911 on himself. It was a Friday evening, and he phoned emergency services claiming he'd had a seizure while alone in his apartment and hit his head. Paramedics arrived and found him conscious, talking, with no visible injuries. They transported him to the ER anyway because that's protocol. I only found out about it when the hospital called me as his emergency contact. By the time I got there, Caleb had already been discharged with instructions to follow up with his neurologist. The ER doctor, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Dr. Raymond Kapoor, pulled me aside in the hallway. He had 23 years of experience in emergency medicine, and he didn't mince words. He told me this was my brother's 4th ER visit in 18 months for reported seizures. Every time, all tests came back normal. Every time, there was no witness to the actual seizure. Every time, Caleb refused recommended follow-up care. Dr. Kapoor said he couldn't diagnose malingering without proof, but he was documenting his concerns in the medical record. I asked Dr. Kapoor what malingering meant, and he explained it was faking or exaggerating medical symptoms for secondary gain, usually financial or to avoid responsibilities. He said in his experience, people who genuinely had seizure disorders didn't have the pattern my brother showed. They had seizures in front of witnesses. They had abnormal EEG results. They showed genuine fear about their condition rather than seeming almost eager to discuss it. When I asked what I should do, Dr. Kapoor said he couldn't tell me how to handle my family situation, but he could tell me the hospital's responsibility was to treat actual medical emergencies, and resources spent on false alarms took away from people who really needed help. He gave me his card and said if I ever needed to discuss my brother's medical history for legitimate purposes, I should call him. I left the hospital with that card in my pocket, feeling validation for my suspicions, but also crushing guilt about what it meant. I started calling the neurologist whose name Caleb had given. The office listed under that name in our city had no record of him as a patient. When I tried other neurologists in the area, I got the same response. I filed a Freedom of Information request for Caleb's disability case file and discovered the medical evidence submitted for his claim came from a now-defunct clinic that had been shut down for fraudulent billing practices. The doctor who'd signed off on Caleb's seizure diagnosis had surrendered his medical license 2 months after writing that evaluation. Everything was starting to look like a house of cards built on lies and exploitation of a system designed to help people who actually needed it. I compiled everything I'd found into a folder. Screenshots, medical records I'd obtained, the pattern documentation, Dr. Kapoor's card, the information about the fraudulent clinic. I showed it to Mom on a Sunday afternoon in September, 2 months before everything fell apart. Mom didn't want to believe it at first. She went through the same rationalizations I'd gone through. Maybe Caleb had made mistakes with the doctor's name. Maybe the clinic closure was coincidental. Maybe the social media posts were old photos he'd posted late. But I'd organized everything chronologically, and the evidence was overwhelming. Mom sat at her kitchen table crying while going through page after page of documentation, showing her son had been lying to her, to the government, to everyone for almost 2 years. She asked me what we should do. I said we needed to confront him together and give him a chance to come clean. If he refused, we'd have to report the fraud to the Social Security Administration. Mom aged 10 years in that conversation. She agreed we'd talk to Caleb the following weekend, giving her time to process and decide what she wanted to say. We went to Caleb's apartment on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Mom knocked, and when he answered, his smile faded instantly, seeing both of us there with serious expressions. We asked to come in, and he reluctantly stepped aside. Mom did most of the talking while I sat next to her on the couch. She told Caleb she loved him, but she knew the seizures weren't real. She showed him the documentation I'd compiled. She asked him to please tell her the truth. Caleb's response was to double down. He got angry, saying we were ambushing him and attacking him when he was vulnerable. He said the stress we were causing could trigger a real seizure right now. When Mom quietly asked him to stop lying, he actually started performing. He grabbed the edge of the counter and his eyes rolled back and his body started shaking. It was the most blatant fake seizure I'd ever seen, theatrical and over the top. Mom just stared at him, tears running down her face, and said his name once. Caleb. He stopped immediately, the shaking ceasing like someone had flipped a switch. The look on his face when he realized the performance hadn't worked was almost pitiful. What followed was 3 hours of Caleb cycling through every manipulation tactic in the book. He tried anger, yelling that we had no right to investigate him. He tried victim playing, crying that we were abandoning him when he needed family support most. He tried gaslighting, insisting his medical records were real and we'd somehow misunderstood everything. He tried bargaining, saying if the seizures had been exaggerated, it was only because he was depressed and didn't know how to ask for help properly. He never actually admitted to faking everything, but he didn't need to. His behavior made it clear. Eventually, Mom told him he had 2 choices: call the Social Security Administration and withdraw his disability claim voluntarily, or she would report the fraud herself. Caleb's face went through a remarkable transformation. The victim mask dropped completely, and something ugly appeared underneath. He told Mom she was dead to him if she did that. He said I'd poisoned her against him because I'd always been jealous of the attention he got. He ordered us both out of his apartment. We left, and Mom was devastated. I drove her home, and she cried the whole way, mourning not just Caleb's lies, but the version of her son she'd believed existed. We decided to wait 1 week to see if Caleb would do the right thing on his own. He didn't. Instead, he went on social media posting about how his family had abandoned him during his medical crisis, painting himself as the victim of heartless relatives who didn't understand invisible disabilities. The posts generated waves of sympathy and outrage directed at us. Friends called Mom asking how she could be so cruel. Distant relatives sent messages defending Caleb. I got Facebook messages calling me an ableist who didn't believe in chronic illness. The irony of being attacked for exposing fraud by people who had no idea what was actually happening was almost funny. Almost. On day 8, Mom called the Social Security Administration fraud hotline. She gave them Caleb's case number and explained her concerns. The woman on the phone, who identified herself as investigator Patricia Vance with 12 years in the fraud detection unit, took detailed notes. She said they'd open an investigation, but it could take months. In the meantime, Caleb's benefits would continue unless they found definitive proof of fraud. Mom asked what constituted definitive proof, and Patricia explained they'd need medical records showing he didn't have the condition he claimed, witness statements documenting the pattern of behavior, and ideally video evidence of him admitting to faking or demonstrating clear physical capability inconsistent with his claimed disability. I had some of that, but not everything. Patricia said she'd be in touch and gave us a case reference number. Mom thanked her and hung up, then sat in silence for 20 minutes. Finally, she said she'd done what she had to do, but it didn't feel good. It felt like betraying her own child, even though, logically, she knew Caleb had betrayed everyone first. Caleb found out about the investigation when he received an official letter from Social Security 3 weeks later. I know because he called me at 7:30 in the morning screaming into the phone. He said I'd destroyed his life. He said when they cut off his benefits, he'd be homeless, and it would be my fault. He said he'd tell everyone the truth about what kind of person I really was. I asked what truth that was, and he couldn't answer, just more rage and accusations. When he finally ran out of steam, I asked him one question. Were any of the seizures real? There was a long silence on the phone. Then Caleb said something I'll never forget. It doesn't matter. I needed help and nobody was helping me, so I helped myself. He hung up before I could respond. That admission, casual and defiant, confirmed everything. He'd known exactly what he was doing. He'd chosen to fake a disability and exploit people's compassion rather than getting actual help for whatever real problems he had. The investigation dragged on for 2 months. Patricia Vance contacted me and Mom for statements. She interviewed Dr. Kapoor from the ER. She subpoenaed medical records from every hospital and clinic Caleb had visited. She requested the documentation I'd compiled showing his social media activity inconsistent with his claimed disability. I gave her everything, including videos I'd secretly recorded of Caleb during family gatherings walking, running, and behaving with perfect coordination during times he was telling Social Security his seizures prevented normal physical activity. Patricia said the evidence was strong and they'd be moving forward with proceedings to terminate his benefits and potentially pursue criminal charges for fraud. Caleb would have an opportunity to appeal and present his own evidence. The hearing was scheduled for January 15th. Caleb hired a lawyer, some guy who advertised on bus benches about fighting for disability rights. The lawyer, Gregory Fisk, with 11 years of experience in disability law, contacted me requesting I reconsider my statement. He said my brother needed family support, not persecution. He implied that I was harassing someone with a genuine medical condition because of personal animosity. I told him to review the actual evidence before making assumptions. He said he had reviewed it, and there were explanations for everything. When I asked what those explanations were, he couldn't provide specifics, just vague statements about medical complexity and the difficulty of diagnosing seizure disorders. I told him I'd be testifying at the hearing and hung up. Gregory tried calling back 3 times. I didn't answer. The hearing took place in a federal building downtown with fluorescent lights and government-issue furniture that had seen better decades. Caleb sat at one table with Gregory Fisk. Mom and I sat behind Patricia Vance at the other table. An administrative law judge named Harold Westbrook, with 32 years on the bench, presided. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Gregory tried to establish that Caleb had a legitimate seizure disorder being misunderstood by family members who weren't medical professionals. Patricia systematically destroyed that narrative with medical records, expert testimony from Dr. Kapoor, and the documentation I'd provided showing the pattern of convenient seizures. The most damning moment came when Patricia played a video I'd recorded at a family barbecue, where Caleb talked about faking sick to get out of work when he was younger, laughing about how easy it was to fool people. Gregory objected that the video was out of context. Judge Westbrook overruled him and admitted it as evidence of pattern behavior. Caleb took the stand in his own defense, and it was painful to watch. He insisted he had real seizures that just happened to not show up on medical tests. He claimed the doctors who'd evaluated him were incompetent. He said his family was lying because of a financial dispute that had nothing to do with his medical condition. When Patricia questioned him about specific inconsistencies, he got flustered and angry, which didn't help his case. Gregory tried to redirect by asking sympathetic questions about how hard it was to live with an invisible disability, but Caleb's answers sounded rehearsed and hollow. Judge Westbrook's expression throughout was carefully neutral, but I could see him making notes every time Caleb contradicted himself or his story diverged from documented evidence. The hearing ended at 4:45 in the afternoon, with Judge Westbrook saying he'd review everything and issue a written decision within 30 days. The decision came back in 22 days. Judge Westbrook found that Caleb had knowingly and willfully made false statements to obtain disability benefits to which he was not entitled. His benefits were terminated immediately. He was ordered to repay $30,180 in overpayments representing the full amount he'd received. The case was being referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution for Social Security fraud, which carried penalties of up to 5 years in prison and $250,000 in fines. Mom cried when she read the decision, but whether from relief or grief or both, I couldn't tell. I felt hollow, vindicated, but empty. Caleb had done this to himself, but I'd been the one to expose him, and I knew he'd never forgive me for that. I also knew I'd made the right choice, that letting him continue defrauding the system would have been worse. Knowing you did the right thing doesn't always make it feel good. Caleb lost his apartment within 2 months when he couldn't pay rent without the disability income. He moved in with a friend who believed his story about being persecuted by his cruel family. Mom reached out offering to help him if he'd come clean and get real help for whatever was actually wrong with him. He refused to speak to her. He blocked both of us on all social media. Friends who donated to his GoFundMe started demanding refunds when word spread about the fraud. Some threatened to sue. Caleb closed down all his social media accounts and disappeared from public view. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to a different city and was working under the table doing construction. Part of me felt bad for him. A larger part felt angry that he was still avoiding accountability and refusing to acknowledge what he'd done. The criminal charges were filed in April, 6 months after the hearing. The U.S. Attorney's Office decided to pursue prosecution based on the strength of the evidence and the amount of money involved. Caleb was charged with 1 count of Social Security fraud and 1 count of making false statements. His public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal where Caleb would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation and restitution. The prosecutor offered a deal: plead guilty, accept 3 years supervised probation, perform 200 hours of community service, and pay back every dollar he'd received. Caleb refused. He insisted on going to trial, apparently believing he could convince a jury that he'd been genuinely confused about his medical condition and hadn't meant to commit fraud. His public defender reportedly tried to talk him out of it, but Caleb was convinced he'd win. The trial was scheduled for June. I was subpoenaed as a witness, which meant I'd have to testify against my own brother in federal court. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Cho, with 15 years of prosecuting white-collar crime, met with me before the trial to prepare my testimony. She explained I'd be asked about my observations of Caleb's behavior, the documentation I'd compiled, and the confrontation where he'd performed a fake seizure. She said defense attorneys often tried to make family witnesses look vindictive or unreliable, so I should stick to facts and stay calm no matter what questions I was asked. I asked what would happen if Caleb was convicted. Linda said the sentencing guidelines suggested 12 to 18 months in federal prison given the amount of fraud and his refusal to accept responsibility. Hearing that number made it real in a way nothing else had. My brother could go to prison because of testimony I'd give. I told Linda I'd tell the truth regardless of consequences. She said that's all anyone could ask. The trial started on a Monday morning in late June. Federal courthouse, wood paneling, American flag, the whole solemn ritual of justice. Caleb sat at the defense table looking defiant and scared in equal measure. Mom came to support me, not Caleb, which I know cost her emotionally. The prosecutor laid out the case over 2 days, calling medical experts who explained that Caleb's described symptoms didn't match any documented seizure disorder, that every medical test had come back normal, and that the pattern of convenient seizures indicated malingering. Dr. Kapoor testified about the suspicious ER visits. Patricia Vance from Social Security testified about the fraudulent medical evidence in Caleb's disability application. I testified on day 3, walking through everything I'd observed, the documentation I'd compiled, and the confrontation. Caleb's attorney tried to paint me as a jealous brother who'd never supported Caleb's medical issues, but the evidence spoke louder than his insinuations. The defense case was weak. Caleb testified again, sticking to his story that he'd really believed he had seizures based on symptoms he experienced. The performance was less convincing than at the administrative hearing. Under cross-examination, Linda Cho systematically broke down every element of his story, showing contradictions with his previous statements and highlighting the convenient timing of every episode. She showed the jury the video of him joking about faking sick. She walked through the financial motive, the GoFundMe money, the disability payments, the pattern of avoiding work. When she asked Caleb directly if he'd ever actually had a seizure, he hesitated just long enough for doubt to register on the jurors' faces before insisting he had. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on both counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 8 weeks later. I didn't attend, but Mom did. She called me afterward from the courthouse parking lot. Judge ruled 15 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised release. Caleb would serve his time at a minimum security facility and be required to pay full restitution on a payment plan after his release. Mom's voice was hollow when she told me. She said Caleb had looked at her from the defendant's table, and she couldn't read his expression. She didn't know if he blamed her or was asking for forgiveness or what. The judge had given Caleb 30 days to get his affairs in order before reporting to prison. Mom asked if I thought we should reach out to him during that time. I said that was up to her, but I wasn't ready to have that conversation. She understood. Everything about this story should have ended there. Caleb going to prison for his fraud, facing consequences for exploiting people's compassion and wasting resources meant for people with real disabilities. Justice served, family fractured, but truth established. That should have been the ending. But life doesn't care about narrative structure or moral closure. What happened next rewrote everything in the cruelest way possible. I got the call from Mom at 6:15 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before Caleb was supposed to report to prison. She was screaming and crying, and I could barely understand her words. Caleb had collapsed. Paramedics were there, but something was wrong. They weren't helping. They thought he was faking again. I needed to come now, right now. It was bad. I threw on clothes and drove to Caleb's new apartment across town, breaking every speed limit, running red lights, my heart hammering in my throat. When I pulled up, an ambulance was in the parking lot, but the paramedics weren't rushing. They were standing near the open door talking to each other, while Mom screamed at them from the doorway. That's when I saw Williams check his watch while Caleb convulsed on the kitchen floor. That's when the horrible truth landed like a physical blow. The paramedics thought this was another scam. They'd been called to Caleb's fake seizures so many times over 2 years that they documented him as a frequent flyer who performed for attention. They didn't believe him. And why would they? He'd trained them not to believe him through dozens of false alarms. This was the boy who cried wolf, except the wolf was real and nobody could see it through the history of lies. At the 3-minute mark, when Williams finally decided this might be genuine, they started real assessment. But they'd lost 3 minutes. In a stroke, every second counts. Brain cells die at a rate of 1.9 million per minute when blood flow is blocked. Caleb had lost 5.7 million brain cells because paramedics had waited to see if he'd drop the act. Williams and his partner moved fast once they committed, starting IV access, checking vitals, loading Caleb onto the gurney. His left side was completely limp now. His face drooped on one side in a way that made him look like a stranger. Williams asked me if Caleb had any history of actual medical conditions, and I had to explain the whole nightmare while they worked. The fraud, the trial, the conviction, the history of fake seizures that made them hesitate. Williams's face went pale as he realized what had happened. His partner was already on the radio calling ahead to the hospital with a stroke alert, but those 3 minutes were gone. Unrecoverable. The ride to County General took 11 minutes. I followed in my car with Mom sobbing in the passenger seat. She kept saying this was her fault, that if she hadn't reported Caleb, the paramedics would have believed him. I tried to tell her this was Caleb's fault for creating the pattern that made people doubt him, but she wasn't listening. We got to the ER and they rushed Caleb straight back to imaging. Dr. Kapoor was on duty, the same doctor who'd suspected Caleb of malingering. I saw recognition flash across his face when they brought Caleb in, then horror as he realized this was real. The CT scan confirmed an ischemic stroke, a clot blocking blood flow to the left side of Caleb's brain. They administered TPA, the clot-busting drug that can reverse stroke damage if given within 4.5 hours of symptom onset. But it works best in the first 60 minutes. Caleb was now at 93 minutes because of the delay. The TPA helped. The clot dissolved. Blood flow returned. But the damage was done. When Caleb regained consciousness 6 hours later, his right side was weak. His speech was slurred. His face still drooped. The neurologist, Dr. Sanjay Mehta, with 18 years of stroke treatment experience, explained that Caleb had suffered significant damage to his motor cortex and language centers. With intensive therapy, he might regain some function, but he'd likely have permanent deficits. Right side weakness, difficulty with speech, possible cognitive impairment. The irony was crushing. Caleb had faked disability for 2 years. Now he actually had one because people hadn't believed him when it mattered. Dr. Mehta said gently that the outcome might have been different with immediate treatment. Every minute counted in stroke care. Those 3 minutes of delay had cost Caleb functionality he'd never fully recover. I visited Caleb in the hospital 3 days later. He was awake, trying to form words with the right side of his face dragging. Mom sat beside his bed holding his left hand, the one that still worked. When Caleb saw me, he tried to speak. What came out was garbled, frustrated sounds that he couldn't control. A speech therapist helped translate. He was trying to say sorry. Sorry for everything. For the lies, the fraud, the waste. For making people stop believing him when he actually needed help. The tears running down his face were real, maybe the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years. I told him I was sorry too. Sorry this happened. Sorry the system failed him because he'd trained it to fail him. Sorry for all of it. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved to dismiss the criminal charges given Caleb's condition. He'd effectively received a life sentence anyway, one he'd created through his own actions. The judge agreed and vacated the conviction. Caleb was released from legal jeopardy, but trapped in a body that no longer fully responded to his commands. He spent 6 weeks in inpatient rehab, learning to walk with a cane, to speak in halting sentences, to use his left hand for tasks that had been second nature. His right hand remained mostly useless, the fingers curled in a permanent partial fist. The rehab team said he'd made remarkable progress considering the extent of damage, but he'd never returned to full function. Caleb was 34 years old with the physical limitations of someone 3 times his age. Mom took him in after rehab because he couldn't live alone anymore. She set up the guest room as his permanent space, installed grab bars in the bathroom, arranged ongoing therapy appointments. Caleb applied for actual disability benefits and was approved immediately with documentation of his genuine impairment. The monthly check he received now was for real need, not fabricated symptoms. He qualified for Medicaid to cover his medical expenses. The system that he'd defrauded now supported him legitimately, providing exactly what he'd pretended to need. I visited them most Sundays. Caleb and I didn't talk much about what happened. What was there to say? He'd gambled on people's compassion and lost in the worst possible way. His fake disability had become real through the consequences of his own fraud. The paramedics who'd delayed treatment faced an internal investigation. Their supervisor reviewed the call recordings and documentation showing Caleb's history. Williams and his partner were cleared of wrongdoing. They'd followed reasonable assessment protocols for a patient with documented malingering behavior. The 3-minute delay was deemed unfortunate, but not negligent given the circumstances. The department issued new guidelines about balancing documented history with present symptoms, but essentially the system absolved them. How could it not? Caleb had created the exact situation that led to their hesitation. He'd trained emergency responders to doubt him through 2 years of false alarms. The delayed treatment was the logical consequence of his own pattern of behavior. Sometimes I think about the version of Caleb who could have existed if he'd asked for help honestly, instead of faking seizures. The brother who could have told Mom and me he was struggling, depressed, scared about the future. We would have helped him. We would have supported actual therapy, job training, whatever he needed. But he chose deception instead, and that choice cascaded into consequences nobody could have predicted. He wanted to avoid responsibility and ended up with impairment that would define the rest of his life. The stroke happened to him, but the delayed treatment was something he created through his own actions. That distinction matters, even if the outcome is equally tragic. I've talked to a therapist about guilt, about whether I should have done something differently, reported him sooner, tried harder to get him help before the fraud became his entire identity. The therapist, Dr. Raymond Cho, with 12 years specializing in family trauma, keeps bringing me back to the same point. I made choices based on the information I had and the values I held. Caleb made different choices. His fraud was his responsibility. The consequences, even the horrible ones, flowed from decisions he made. I can feel sad about the outcome without taking ownership of blame that belongs to him. That helps some days. Other days I just feel the weight of it all, the way one person's lies can ripple outward and destroy things that can never be rebuilt. Mom struggles with it differently. She wonders if reporting him triggered some stress that contributed to the stroke. I've shown her the medical literature. Strokes at 34 are rare but happen, usually from undiagnosed conditions or lifestyle factors. Caleb smoked, ate terribly, never exercised, had high blood pressure he ignored. The stroke was brewing long before the trial. But Mom needs to assign causation somewhere, and she chooses herself, because that feels more controllable than random medical catastrophe. I can't argue her out of that guilt any more than I can resolve my own. We just carry it together and try to help Caleb navigate his new reality. A year later, Caleb has made progress. He walks without the cane sometimes. His speech has improved to where strangers can understand him most of the time. His right hand functions enough to hold objects, though fine motor control never fully returned. He volunteers at the hospital where he recovered, helping with stroke patient support groups, telling his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of honest medical reporting. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The man who faked disability now educates actual patients about the medical system. He tells them about the boy who cried wolf, about the consequences of deception, about how he destroyed his own credibility and paid the price when truth finally mattered. Some patients find it helpful. Others think he's getting what he deserved. Both reactions are valid. I don't know if Caleb has forgiven himself. I don't know if I've completely forgiven him. Forgiveness feels like the wrong framework for this whole situation. What happened wasn't a simple wrong that can be absolved through apology and time. It was a complex cascade of choices and consequences that destroyed lives and changed our family permanently. Caleb is my brother. I love him. I also know he created the circumstances that led to permanent disability through fraud, lies, and exploitation of people's goodness. Both things are true. They exist together in uncomfortable tension that doesn't resolve into clean categories of victim or villain. He's both and neither, just a person who made catastrophic choices and lives with the results every day. The story became local news eventually. Man who faked disability suffers real stroke. During fraud trial, ran in 3 newspapers. The articles were sympathetic to Caleb, portraying him as someone whose cry for help was ignored. I found that interpretation frustrating but understandable. The full context was too complex for a 500-word news story. The years of deliberate fraud, the trial, the conviction, the history with paramedics, all of it reduced to a simple tragedy of miscommunication. But maybe that's the right framing for public consumption. Maybe the messy truth about fraud and consequences and culpability is too heavy for general interest. I just know that living through it was different than reading about it, and the reality was darker and more complicated than any headline could capture. If there's a lesson in this mess, it's probably about the cost of deception. Not the moral cost in some abstract sense, but the practical consequence of training people not to believe you. Caleb spent 2 years making everyone around him doubt his claims. When truth finally mattered, that doubt delayed life-saving treatment. He built his own trap and walked into it at the worst possible moment. That's not justice exactly, since the punishment far exceeded the crime. But it is consequence, pure and brutal and inescapable. You can't build your life on lies without those lies eventually becoming the foundation that collapses beneath you. Caleb learned that lesson in the harshest way possible, and now we all live with the wreckage. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.